Hello, this is Michael with Access Woodworks, and today we're going to be talking about an old technique I discovered for turning bowls on a lathe with nothing but a faceplate and some basic turning tools. I bought this old lathe out of the back of a barn a few years ago so that I could repair some chairs for friends and family. I found I did enjoy turning, and I wanted to get a little better at doing it. One of the things I wanted to learn how to do was to turn bowls. Unfortunately, everything I found online had people using extremely fancy lathes. They had 3 and 4 jaw chucks. When I looked up the prices on those, they were about $200, which is about twice as much as this lathe cost me, and I didn't really want to spend that much to turn some bowls down. I did eventually find an interesting technique utilizing faceplates where you take your blank, mount it to a faceplate, you turn down your outer profile first and put a small tenon on the bottom of it, and then you take your blank off, take your faceplate, mount another block to it, then put a small mortise into it, glue the two of them together with cyanoacrylate, mount them on the lathe, and then turn the inside of your bowl. This technique's actually worked pretty well for me. I had some difficulty with the first few bowls, but once I started doing this, no problem at all. So I'm going to show you really quickly how to do this. Okay, so we're going to start this process out by mounting our bowl blank to a 4-inch plate or whatever plate you've got, and then putting that on your lathe. This is just a bowl blank that I glued up out of some walnut and maple. As a side note, in learning, I have discovered that walnut has a horrible problem with grain tear out across the edge of the grain when you're turning. In retrospect, I knew this because I've had issues making end grain walnut cutting boards. So pretty much have the same issue. You make sure your tools are exceptionally sharp, and there's a few people who've posted some interesting techniques for filling in the tear out on walnut. One gentleman had coated his piece in shellac and then sanded it down to get the sand and the shellac to fill in the grain. So that seems to work pretty well too. I've tried that. But at any rate, so we get this mounted in. This is not going to be a lesson on wood turning. There's plenty of them out there. I'm just going to show you the technique. I'm going to speed through the turning and then show you the technique of putting the tenon in, and then we'll put a mortise on our other piece, and we'll glue them together, and I'll kind of show you how all that works. So now that we have finished turning the exterior profile of the bowl, we're ready to cut a small tenon on the bottom, maybe about 1/8 of an inch high, and that tenon will be there so that when we remove the bowl, we can flip it over, attach another piece of wood to the faceplate, cut a small mortise in it, and then glue the tenon and mortise together. That will give us a secure fixture to turn the inside of the bowl down. So in figuring out how to cut the tenon on here so that it's nice, crisp, straight, and will glue up very well, I've seen a couple of different techniques between woodworking books and videos from professional wood turners demonstrating this technique. A lot of them will use a scraper or will use a parting tool to try and run a straight cut across the bottom to get a nice tenon on it. for my purposes, I don't really have the skill level to get a really smooth cut either with a parting tool or a more traditional scraping tool such as this, which is one of the reasons why I ended up making a chucking scraper, which is available in previous videos. And I wanted to have a nice sharp corner on here so that the tenon shoulder was straight and perpendicular to the surface of the bottom of the bowl. That was one area I was having difficulty with. So I ended up making this tool specifically to help with that. I did cut a slight undercut underneath it. I have discovered with using it, just like any other scraper or gouge, you do need to make sure you have a nice burr on the edge so that you have a good cutting surface to make a nice smooth clean cut, especially with something like walnut here, which does have an issue with grain tear out. We will demonstrate how to make the tenon on the bowl, and then the mortise goes on the other plate, and I'll show you how all that goes together. So we're going to try and make this about 1/8 of an inch deep and maybe an inch and a quarter in diameter. So again, my goal is to get a very sharp and straight edge there, which this mortising tool here will get in, a chucking scraper. Do have some grain tear out on the end, and that's, unfortunately, that's what's expected with walnut. So we're almost to 1/8. Do a little bit more. Make sure it's perpendicular. Make sure it's nice and straight. We need everything to be flat and smooth to provide a good solid surface for the glue up. So there we are. I think. Make sure this looks. There we go. So it looks like we have a nice straight, pretty straight there. So, all right. So now we can take this off, put another piece of wood blank on there, cut our mortise, and then glue it together. Okay, so now that we have finished turning the tenon on the bottom of our bowl, we need to make a mating mortise for it and another piece of wood. And so what I've done is I've taken my faceplate, I've mounted a small piece of wood to it that we'll be able to cut our mortise into to match the tenon so that we can mate them together and then turn the inside of the bowl down. So what we'll do is mount this up. And I'm pretty sure this is flat, but we'll go through flatness with a scraper real quick, and then we'll cut our tenon in there. And so the way we get our tenon diameter is I will take, my mortise diameter is, I will take what my tenon is, and that's the center of the tenon, and I am going to measure it out with these dividers. Mount this up here. I'm going to find the center with my divider so I can just kind of see where the middle is, and then I will mark the outside of my mortise with that. So just to kind of show you what I've done. So while this was spinning, I found the center with my divider. And then use the other edge to scribe a line. And so that should be, if we look here, about the same diameter, which it looks good to me from here, from this standpoint. So now we'll just use our chucking scraper to remove the material on the inside of this mortise. So the interesting thing with this shape is it lets me get a really sharp edge. And to keep clearing those chips so we can see what we're doing. I know I still need to work on my technique, but we're getting there. So this is getting a pretty flat bottom in it, much flatter than I could get with the parting tool, because I have tried doing this with a parting tool before. I seem to get a lot of ridges. So this is just producing a very flat bottom with straight sides, which is exactly what I want. Let's see where we're at in terms of our depth here. Do a quick measurement there. And here, we got a little ways to go still. Now the key to good glue joints is always flatness. The flatter the wood, the smoother it is, the better your joint is going to be. And since we'll be turning this, we want to have the strongest joint possible. Let's take a look at this again here. We're getting there. A little bit more over here. See where we are. Just about there. We do have a fairly smooth bottom there. Before I finish this off, I'm going to take this to the grinder, sharpen that, get a new burr on there so we get a really smooth surface. I've seen some of the experts recommend before you do your final pass in a bowl that you do want to make sure you resharpen your gouge or scraper, whatever you're using, to make sure you got a good sharp burr on there to help get a smooth surface. So that's what we did. And so try to get our need a little bit more. Okay. Alright, let's see where we're at with our diameter. There we go. Pretty good. It's not really, probably should be a little bit tighter, but it's not moving around in there. So, alright, so that's good. So now what we can do is glue up our tenon into our mortise, let that set, and then we should be able to start on the inside of our bowl. Alright, so that now that we have everything put together, glued up with CA glue, mounted in here, we are ready to start turning the inside of our bowl. And I did start a little bit, but we'll now, one of the issues I found with walnut is that we do tend to have an issue with grain tear out on the walnut. And in doing some research, what I found is that when you're turning the inside of the bowl, you want to go from the outside towards the center. When you're turning the outside of the bowl, you want to go from the bottom out, so that the grain has support while you're actually cutting it. So at some point in time, if I get better at this, I'll probably do a video demonstrating that. Once I finish turning the inside of the bowl, it's time to remove it from the scrap piece of wood. At that point, all I need to do is cut my tenon off with a flush cut saw. And I'm able to slide it down in there pretty easily. Cut that off and then sand the bottom of my bowl flat. And that finishes the bowl. This is probably the least expensive way I've seen to make a bowl with a lathe without having to purchase a lot of extra equipment. All you need is a lathe faceplate, and you need a way to be able to cut your mortise and tenon. As I had mentioned earlier, you can use a parting tool to get a fairly sharp mortise and tenon. I was having difficulty keeping the bottom flat, which is why I went ahead and made this chucking scraper. This isn't something that's commercially available, but I was able to make one for about $15 or $20, and that allowed me to get a very clean and sharp mortise and tenon joint so that I could safely turn my bowl. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. Please like and subscribe.